This dissertation talks about modern slavery and how it has been created, developed and established over the past decades all over the world. Modern slavery refers to a situation of exploitation from which a person cannot escape because of threat, violence or abuse of power. The form in which it manifests itself can be that of forced prostitution, domestic servitude, debt bondage and exploitation of illegal labor. Neo-slavery is a chaotic, dynamic and changing phenomenon whose hallmarks are its assertion by means of violence and the enslaved person's loss of control over his or her own life. This extreme violation of human rights afflicts between 40 and 200 million of people in the world, subjugated and exploited by others for profit alone. Modern slavery is optionally the theft of life itself. According to the world leading expert on modern slavery, Kevin Bales, exist three factors in the transition from traditional to modern slavery and can be identified in 3 points. The first is the population boom that involved the world after World War II, thus increasing the number of poor people and potential slaves in world markets. The second is the revolution of economic globalization and the modernization of agriculture, which took away from poor peasants what little they owned, exposing them to the risk of slavery. And finally, the third is the tremendous mix of violence, avidity, and corruption produced in so many developing countries, where modernization has facilitated only the rich and aggravated the situation of poor, making them even poorer. Also, helping the slavers are some distorted religious fundamentalism that justifies slavery, and again, discrimination against women and widespread social acceptance of prostitution make the situation worse. Three basic forms of slavery can be distinguished, the characteristics of which sometimes intersect with each other. The first is debt bondage, in which an individual commits himself or his life in exchange for a loan of money. The duration and nature of the service is at the discretion of the creditor, and their service does not contribute to reducing the original debt, even to the point of passing from one generation to the next. The second is contractual slavery, in which contracts are offered to guarantee legal employment, but once brought to the workplace, workers discover that those contracts were fictitious. The contract is used as lure to entice an enslaved as well as give it a veneer of legality. The third is servitude that is based on possession, which is the form most reminiscent to traditional slavery, in which a human being becomes a slave after being captured or as the child of a slave woman. In addition to these three forms, there is state slavery, where people are forced to work for a tyrannical government and employed in military operations, or forced marriages, where young women are forced to marry men sometimes much older than themselves, and the child soldiers who are recruited in paramilitary organizations. In ancient times, the relationship between slave and master was legally regulated by the institution of property and characterized by ethnic, racial, or religious differences. In contrast, today, it is the dominant economic and cultural inequalities that create the condition for the enslavement of millions of human beings from the farthest reaches of the earth. They are men, women, and children fleeing wars or situations of severe economic hardship, who are bought by slavers at a low price and treated as if they were disposable objects. But we would be mistaken if we thought that slavery is only an issue in war and famine zones. Human trafficking also exists in the city of Rome and the Agropontino, with their phenomena of forced prostitution and labor exploitation, and it is also present in today's war between Russia and Ukraine, where millions of women and children fleeing and unprotected are subject to the risk of falling into the trade slave. The UN has recommended that government institutions do their part to eradicate slavery by 2030, as set out in Section 8.7 of the Agenda for Sustainable Development. What is needed is an approach that addresses the cause and roots of the phenomenon as it occurs in different local realities. It is necessary to present it and mitigate the vulnerabilities of potential victims, and therefore options that promote access to microcredit and microsocial insurance are welcome, as are agricultural reforms that allow everyone to have a piece of land to cultivate and which with to sustain themselves. The criminalization of forced marriages and the tightening of prison sentences to trafficking offenders are also needed. But we too, as individuals, cannot remain indifferent to the scourge of humanity. The pursuit of profit, maximizing saving and minimizing the cost of the production chain, feeds the dark side of the global economy, made up of the enslavement of vulnerable human beings. We are indirectly complicit in this distortion when we are agreed to buy a very low cost products that are the result of extorted labor. We individuals must insist with our rulers that they adopt effective sanctions against countries that tolerate slavery and support humanitarian organizations that fight it. Concrete facts are needed because the struggle to erase slavery continues. We can and must do more.